Welcome to another edition of the Ab Astra podcast, discussing the history of astrology with several scholars and researchers on the field. Today we have with us Dorian Greenbaum.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Dorian received her PhD from the Warburg Institute on her investigation on the daimon, on Hellenistic tradition. And this was also the topic of the book that came out of the PhD, which is entitled The Daimon in Hellenistic Astrology, Origins and Influences, and it was published by Brill in 2016. Quite a large book. Dorian has also published a number of papers. I'm not going to quote every one of them, but one that I can remember is one she authored with Alexander Jones on a very interesting chart example where the lots were quite present in an old Hellenistic chart. We'll put the link for these articles later in the page of this podcast. She has also recently participated in an edited volume by Francesca Rochberg on the Hellenistic traditions as well, the science and in its context, I believe. I'm doing this correctly. Quite recent, 2020. It's still this year.
Yes, it just came out. Could I just say the exact title? Is that okay?
Yes, that's perfect. Perfect.
It's called, and I can even, as we do on Zoom. Mm-hmm. This is the volume. It's called Hellenistic Astronomy, the Science in Its Contexts, and it's co-edited actually by Alan Bowen and Francesca Rothberg. Mm-hmm. It's also quite a massive book. It contains material from pretty much all of the cultures of the Mediterranean region in that time frame around the centuries around the turn of the millennium, from BCE to CE.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, it's quite an interesting collection. So you're participating in quite a rich collection of works and research from this period, which is quite nice. You also edited other books together with Charles Burnett. I remember the one
from Masahala to Kepler.
From Kepler, exactly. Yes. This was 2015, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And you have published a number of articles. You also published and edited volumes on the what's called Culture and Cosmos. You also edited the Kepler volume, yes. And you have published many articles. I'm not going to give a complete list here.
No, that's fine.
Well, we can stay.
So welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation to participate here. So we would start by asking you your experience.
Well, first of all, let me just say that Dorian is the first, or at least one of the first, but I believe you are the first person who studied, who dared to bring the history of astrology into this field, and in this context, you are a pioneer, and we all owe you, because you were like breaking the ice for everyone else, and in this perspective, I would like to ask you, what are your views on the academic reception of the history of astrology? I know it's a long, complicated and complex question, but just your personal views on this, taking into account that you were, I believe, the first person who did this kind of research, and your PhD is like opened the doors for everybody else, including me and Luis. So what are your views on this? What has changed, if anything has changed?
Oh, well, that's quite an interesting
A long
topic. Yes. Yes, I think you are referring to the fact that I was the first practicing astrologer to be a PhD student at the Warburg Institute. And well, it was an interesting experience. I think there's pros and cons on each within each kind of group on both sides, really, because practitioners, and I found this to be true certainly in my own work, I found that I had actually a great advantage in really understanding the historical material because I had experience in practice. And that was a great advantage to me in doing the work for my PhD, which was on a topic in the history of astrology, and not a book like a typical practicing astrologer's book, which will maybe concentrate on techniques and methods and the actual craft of astrology and how to interpret. But on the other hand, I think in the last maybe 25 or 30 years, the scholarship in the history of astrology has really become, maybe mainstream is not quite the right word to use, but it's become more acceptable to even study this kind of thing. And we now have, I mean, it's still quite a small field, let's face it. we could put all of our colleagues in one room together, and it probably wouldn't be like a football stadium or anything like that. But I think that there's less maybe stigma attached to studying this, and I think it's become more reputable to study this, and I think the same maybe is also true of studying other sort of esoteric fields like magic than it used to be, and there's much less prejudice.
Yes,
I think.
I have to say that apart from having the practical knowledge on the field, you also had a very solid knowledge of Greek, ancient Greek.
Well, yes.
And that also was like, I mean, it came off like
candy.
Well, yeah, and of course I was basing the topic of my PhD on the fact that I knew I was going to be looking at primary texts in Greek. I mean, I was very, I was very lucky because I happened to have a background as a classics major, as an undergraduate, and then I studied Egyptology at Columbia, and I got a master's in that. So I was coming in with a somewhat unusual background to have all those skills available to me. Yes. So I had both Greek and Latin, and also some ancient Egyptian. That
you had the correct tools and the set of knowledge that would support your study.
I would say a unique set of tools to address this topic, because your PhD was on Hellenistic astrology.
Yes.
So it was well, you said it was lucky, but it is actually a lot of work. It was not just luck.
Well, I mean, it was lucky that I happened to have those skills to be able to do that kind of work. No. I don't want to imply that I just sort of sat down one night and dashed off a PhD thesis.
No, I think it was exactly like that.
Yeah. Not trying to discourage other people who might want to do a PhD, but it has its its joys and its depressions, shall we say.
Yes, we all know that.
We all know that. We all know that. Yeah. But it was just wonderful to be in a place like the Warburg Institute, which after they, after I was, I kind of became one of the group, you know, and they realized that I actually was doing decent scholarship. It was, and I should also point out that this was certainly not the case with my supervisor, Charles Burnett, who was perfectly fine from the beginning.
Supervisor, we were all very, very lucky.
Very, very, very lucky to have him. I feel very lucky that I was in the right place at the right time, so that could even happen. But being in the Warburg, which is such a fabulous intellectual environment for a scholar and a student, and the collegiality of many of the people who work and study there, it was just a great place to be. I wouldn't have wanted to be any other place.
So I think that is the special place to be.
Yeah,
and with a wonderful supervisor. I think it was really the magical combination of everything come together. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It was a happy confluence of many things that just created the situation that I found myself in for almost 4 years. You know, with my family on the other side of the pond.
Well, and you now are yourself a tutor. I didn't mention that. A tutor in the program of the university. Sorry, to clarify. So Lampeter.
Yeah. Well, I teach on the MA in cultural astronomy and astrology at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, at the physical campuses in Lampeter, which is in Wales. Yes. So I'm teaching in the field that I'm expert in, which is very nice.
Yes, it is. It's always a good. And so, currently, what have been your interests of research? What have you developed in the current years? Of course, you're still working on Hellenistic. It's your specialty, and build the timeline, that little piece of the timeline where you focus and where's your interest. And could you tell us a bit more of
your present research?
Your present research and all the work that you have been presenting in several lectures.
Yes. Because of the topics that I was looking at for my PhD, I became extremely interested in the concept of astrological lots, which in the medieval tradition become known as Arabic parts, and I think even in modern astrology that's a common way to refer to them, although I would argue that their origin is not Arabic. and I like to use the word lot because it gives the sense of allotment and the actual way the people in that time frame would have understood what a lot was, of having all of the qualities that we associate with even things like, on a very common level, the lottery. You know, so this idea of bringing in an idea of divination and of using the techniques that they would use in ancient lot divination, applied to astrology in a fairly systematic way, but the underlying origin is still quite present even in that word lot. So that's why I think we should be saying lot and not part, because part doesn't give that semantic or etymological sense. that Lot does.
Yes.
But anyway, yeah. So I became interested in Lot's first because I was writing about the daimon in Hellenistic astrology, and I suppose I should just give a quick sort of definition of what a daimon is. In the practice of astrology, it can have a number of different meanings, and in the Greek cultural milieu, daimon is a very multivalent term. So it can refer to some kind of semi-divine being that, as Plato would say, can be an intermediary between gods and humans, and can facilitate communication between gods and humans. In the myth of the souls who are about to reincarnate choose a daimon to accompany them into incarnation, and this daimon will guide their lives once they've ratified the choices that they've made about that life. So there's that sense of daimon. And of course, in astrology, right in the mechanics, we have in the astrological places, the 12 portions of the chart that are each associated with a different area of life. We have 2 places, or houses as they're known in modern astrology, of the good daimon and the bad daimon. And people don't think about that very much in modern astrology, and everybody and they're the 11th and 12th places or houses, and people sometimes, especially with the 11th place, they just wonder what to do with that place. Oh, it's friends and hopes and wishes, and they don't think about the concept of daimon, which is another thing that I wanted to explore in my thesis. So there's that part, and then in addition to the lot of fortune, which many astrologers will know about, the mirror image of that lot, it's formed by the reversal of the formula for the lot of fortune. You get the lot of daimon, which is often known by modern astrologers as the lot of spirit. Although again, that doesn't really convey the concept of what daimon is. So my other goal is to get people to call it the lot of daimon and not the lot of spirit. This is a fairly long explanation, basically, of how I came to be interested in this topic, and so I've stayed interested in that, even in the subsequent work that I've done, even though I've written about a bunch of other different things as well. And recently, actually, it was I can't call it a conference. It was a colloquium that was held to honor Charles Burnett. This was a few years ago, and I presented I presented a talk on the tradition of planetary lots in Abu Mashar's work, which included, of course, the lots of fortune and daimon that are prominent in Hellenistic astrology, to other lots called the lots of eros, or love, and necessity, which are also part of the tradition in Hellenistic astrology, plus 3 more lots that are associated with the planets. And I was interested in that because, now you tell me if I'm going too far.
Oh, please.
Okay, I'll keep talking. You can edit that bit out if you want.
We don't.
Just perhaps to explain people who are listening and who do not have a complete knowledge, a lot is a mathematical point which is calculated between 2 points in the chart, usually 2 planets, and then projected from a third point, usually the rising degree in a chart, or the ascendant,
Yes.
or horoscope, as it's known in the Hellenistic tradition. So it is a mathematical point that will have a certain significance in the interpretation points. So all these planetary lots that you're speaking of are a small part of this huge tradition of computation within the chart, the astrological chart.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for. See, I just assume these things. I take them for granted, and I'm like, well, everybody knows what that is, right? Yes, that's exactly right. The lots are formed by taking the arc between usually two planets, and that degree distance is then projected from a third point. It's usually the ascendant. In the case of the lot of fortune, you're looking at the arc between the sun and the moon and projecting that from the ascendant. And the lot of diamond, you're taking the same arc but projecting it in the opposite direction, and that's where you get this idea of a mirror image. What I discovered when I was doing my PhD research was that there were actually other lots that depended on those two. And I discovered these in Vettius Valens when he's talking about the lots of eros or love and the lot of necessity. And I hadn't really noticed this before, but I looked at the passage that he was talking about I think it's in book 4 of his anthologies. And at the bottom of the page, I think it was near the bottom of the page in the Greek edition, I noticed that there were formulae for these lots of love and necessity. And I looked at what they were, and they were different from the ones that I knew from Paulus of Alexandrinus, which coincidentally was the first and probably only translation that I made of an ancient astrologer's text. Instead of using for love the arc between Venus and the lot of diamond, and for necessity using the arc between Mercury and the lot of fortune, Valens actually took the lots of fortune and diamond and the arc between those and projected it in one way for the lot of eros and the opposite way for the lot of necessity, so that you get this really beautiful double mirror image which connects all of the lots. And I thought this was very interesting, and Valens uses those 4 lots quite a bit in interpretation, in interpretation of charts. So I thought, well, how come I didn't know about this? And I realized as I was looking at the text, this is probably, I don't know, probably 2006 when I first started looking seriously at Valens and these lots, that the formula for each of those lots, eros or love and necessity, were bracketed, square bracketed by the editor, who was David Pingree, and that's what you do in a text when you think something's spurious.
Yes.
And I thought, well, this doesn't really sound bogus to me. This sounds like these formula must be legitimate. Why have I not heard of them? And I started looking through other writers on ancient astrology, like starting with Boucher-Leclerc and various other people. And I realized that pretty much scholarship had pretty much just accepted the formulae for those 2 lots that were in Paulus. And the Valens formula had been completely forgotten. They would say, oh, well, this isn't right, and this is why I think Pingree had square bracketed them out.
It could be an error or an error transmission or some sort of...
Yes, I think that's what they thought, that it was some kind of error of transmission. But then I went and looked at one of the little Bibles of Hellenistic astrology, which is called Greek Horoscopes. It's a book that contains primary source documents of ancient horoscopes, edited by Otto Neugebauer and H.B. Van Hosen. there are very few charts that calculate these two lots of Eros and necessity. There are more that calculate the lots of fortune and diamond, and I actually wrote an article about that for Culture and Cosmos. But very few charts calculate all four of those lots. But I discovered, amazingly, that they used this formula that took the arc between fortune and diamond and projected it in one direction or another from the ascendant in all of the documentary charts. And they're not very many. There may be 4 or 5, you know. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, no one's ever mentioned this before. I mean, that I knew of, right? And so I came to discover that there were variants on this formula, that Valens had projected them in one way and Firmicus Maternus projected them in another way, but the documentary charts were sort of evenly divided in which formula was used in the chart. And you can go look at these charts in Neugebauer and Van Hosen. So I got very interested in that. The reason that I'm going into such detail here is because I later had to take a look at the Paulist tradition of lots, in which he mentions that he got, well, Olympiodorus actually mentions that they come from a book called the Panaretos, and that it's a Hermetic text. And that has been the tradition that sort of came down through astrology and into modern scholarship. However, when I started to look at people like Abu Mashar, and I looked at what he's calling the planetary lots, right? I realized that he's calling this group of 7 lots that he calls planetary lots, each associated with a planet, right? And at the 7 classical planets, including the sun and moon, I came to discover that he gives the formula, the formulas for them, for the lot of what he's calling the lot of Venus. He's using the Valens formula that uses the arc between fortune and diamond. And the lot of Mercury, which Valens calls the lot of necessity, is doing the reversal of that formula, right? He's calling them planetary lots, but he's not using planets in them.
Yes.
And I found that was very, very interesting. And it seemed to be, and I didn't have time to explore this in my thesis because my thesis was sort of based in the Hellenistic milieu, the Mediterranean region, roughly from the 2nd century BCE into late antiquity, right? I was already way over the word limit. There was no way I could get into medieval astrology at that time.
I remember that phase when you were like finishing the book and with too many words, so to say, and trying to fit everything neatly into the book. I do remember that.
Yes.
It was, very stressful, I have to say.
You mean in your situation?
No, in your situation.
My situation. Oh, yes, it was extremely.
You had so many ideas, and you had the limits.
Yes, I had to, right at the very end, about 4 months before I had to hand my thesis in, I discovered I was well over the word limit, and I had to cut chapters, and I had to truncate things, and so there was no way that I could do anything about this interesting, what I saw as sort of an interesting conflation of these 2 lot traditions in Abu Mashar. The best that I could do was to, sort of mention it in a footnote, which I did in my thesis and also in my book. So you can find that, a very sort of 1-page reference to this work.
Footnote, like
Yes, I was just looking at the footnote this afternoon. Yes, it's about that long. Yeah, you know how we do in scholarship land. We we have copious footnotes. I remember one of my fellow students was so happy. She came to me showing me part of a chapter that she'd written that had 2 lines of text at the top, and the whole rest of the page was footnotes. Because you know we have to. If we're properly trained, we have to document everything that we find and give evidence for everything that we say. Yeah. So yes, so I couldn't really take up this idea at the time that I wrote my thesis. I could just allude to it as a future project, you know, how we do, and so when I had this opportunity to present this material for Charles at what is in the process of becoming his Festschrift. You know, I was very happy to look at that material in a lot more detail and to really get into some of the nitty-gritty about why he might have done this, what were his sources, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
The transmission of that kind of
lineage. The transmission, yes, the transmission, and how not only how it gets to Abu Mashar and what he does with it, which is interesting and which I explore in the paper that's going to be in the Festschrift, but the later transmission too. In the thesis, I think I mentioned a couple of a few people who seem to have relied on Abu Mashar's explanation of these lots. And Bonatti was probably the most well-known person that I mentioned, and he relies very heavily on Abu Mashar. So he was clearly influenced by Abu Mashar's position, but you know, I couldn't really get into more detail at that time, so that had to wait until this present piece of work that is in process, shall we say?
Yes, in publication.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
I think it is also very interesting to see how one historian, just because he put this into square brackets, because it was his choice, he had his reasons, of course, his perception, and this influenced all the other historians until someone, noticed, no, this should be the main text. This should be in the main text. So the way we deal with the sources, the choices we made when we are working or writing about the sources, they can influence.
They have repercussions. And,
they have consequences.
Sometimes quite intense in the way that the topic is.
The way we perceive the source and the way we perceive the ideas.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I had never seen anybody even mention these formulae, and the interesting thing is that I think I should verify this, but I have in my head that when I looked at Neugebauer and Van Hosen, who have examples of these charts using these formulae, right? But in their little commentary about the lots, they don't even mention that. Yes. That there are 2 different ways of doing it. I think they even just mention the way Paulus does it. Nothing about anyone else like Valens or Firmicus, even though the evidence is right there in the examples they have in their book.
Probably they were coming from another perspective, and this just escaped them.
Yes.
Yeah. Because the previous scholarship and had taken Paulus on board and all of his work on lots, and assumed that was the main tradition, or the only tradition, really. And the other thing I wanted to say, you reminded me when you said the square bracket thing, was that I of course immediately consulted Charles Burnett about this, and I said, do you have I know, it was their microfilm. It's the manuscript that was used in the critical edition. Actually, one of the main manuscripts used in this edition of Valens was a Selden manuscript from Oxford. And I believe that Charles had access to a microfilm or something I asked him, I think he went to Brown or something, and I said, could you look, and he raised microfilm. Tell me if you see anything weird about how this formula is presented. Is it in a different hand? Does it seem like some kind of spurious insertion? And he came back and said, no, it looks like everything else.
It's normal, yeah.
Yeah, and the choice of the historian, of the researcher, was, so for some reason he decided to separate these parts.
Well, I think because the scholarly tradition had ignored this other way of doing it, and right at the end of my thesis, right before I handed it in, or maybe right after I handed it in, I got the opportunity to go to the Bodleian Library and look at that manuscript myself. So I got to see it in the end, and I got to see that indeed no change in handwriting, nothing to make one think that it was in some way interpolated or whatever.
It looked normal text.
Just normal text. Yeah, just normal text, exactly like what was before it and what came after it. So, yeah.
This is really the importance of not only, respecting the text or trying to understand the text in its own terms.
Absolutely.
Sometimes difficult because we live in another century.
Yeah. And then when we're researching over something else, someone else research, the importance of looking
at the
source, because sometimes the researcher was not focused on that particularity and missed something or didn't pay enough attention, and sometimes we assume that they did and they did not, or they reached a different conclusion. And sometimes going back to the documents just becomes clear that there was an error, or someone missed something, or there was a misperception of some sort.
Simply the researcher was interpreting something in the light of what was known back then, and now we know more.
Yeah.
So it's really important. I know you know this, to look at the sources and to return to the sources.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
New eyes for the sources.
Yes, absolutely. And even later when I came to write this article with Alexander Jones about the only ancient horoscope that contains all 7 of Paulus's lots in the same formula that Paulus uses. And here I need to credit Alexander Jones for, first of all, finding that horoscope sort of buried in the Berlin archives, and understanding immediately what it was and how important it was. And again, another happy confluence of circumstances, allowed us to present this chart. But it also gives you the opportunity again to revisit the Paulus text and to think about that. And so, scholarship is always evolving, and we should never be thinking that, we've solved that problem forever.
That's the forever part.
The
is
forever
the one
part
that's
is really failing.
We are always solving the problems in new ways, and we are always looking at the topics that we study with new eyes. That is so, and especially when it comes to this astrology or these fields that are so complex and so rich, and so with so many variants. So we really need to look at the sources.
Look at things with new eyes and do a revision.
Yes, and here I was, just this little PhD student, with no qualifications. In some ways, it's helpful to not come in with any preconceptions, because that allows you,
Important.
Yeah.
yeah, it helps you to avoid assumptions.
Yeah, it's not about knowing everything. It's about asking the right questions.
Yes.
In this field, I think Charles Burnett is one of the persons that I know that is more open-minded, because he's really always asking new questions, always able to become enchanted with a new idea.
Yes, for sure. Yes, absolutely. Yes, that's one of his great gifts.
So it's really important, as we were discussing, the importance of sources and revisiting sources. And I think anyone who is dealing with documents, really with the direct source of any sort, will have this experience of going at something that's already translated, edited, etc., and then spotting these small discrepancies that weren't there, pages that they think that didn't exist and they're actually there in the document, which can become quite precious to
Yes.
enhance and to really give new information to research and to highlight the research. And I think that's an excellent point. So, in which you have to build not only your own views and the novelties that you're finding by revisiting the text, but also the history of research that has been done on that topic, on that text, on that document, so that you're building in a progress of research. And that's
exactly any opinion that we have, and we should have opinions because it's our contribution, but any opinion that we have should be inserted in this context of scholarity, other scholars that already had done their research, and then we can have our opinion, we can contribute, you can agree or you can disagree, but within this context, not just because.
Yes, it's very, very important, I think, to look at previous scholarship when you're working on,
and give them credit also, as you know.
well, of course.
Every time that we pick up ideas from other scholars, just mention them.
Yes, of course. And I frequently I will say something like, I am indebted to so and so for inspiring my thought in this direction, or whatever it is,
Yes, sometimes even if it is like an informal conversation, like the ones we have sometimes, we just say, I'm grateful to this person
for
because
noting this, or
yes, or for discussing this with me, or because for mentioning this somewhere. Sometimes it's not even about a book, or it's just that the person mentioned something that sent us in the right direction, and it is correct and actually elegant to say, I'm grateful to this person because our previous conversation or something that I heard from this person helped me to develop this line of thought.
Yes, I mean that's how scholarship advances, and that's how we should be thinking of it, as we're all little beads in the necklace. Moving forward.
I just had a comment question. I don't know exactly what to call it about the lots, which has to do with its practice. So we have some evidences, and I know you discussed this in your paper, then in the paper you were about to publish. There are some evidences of the uses of these lots, sporadic. It's difficult to ascertain exactly which lots they use in which time, because from what I understand, exactly what you were saying, there is some variance and they come back to older formulas, and it's difficult to have a clear picture of exactly what were they using. But do you know, or are you intending to do a work that is more, how shall I ask this, goes more into the evidences? So you have the Hellenistic corpus of charts, which some, a very few number, have this kind of lot calculation, but also are you intending to explore how these evolve then into other horoscopic traditions that are deriving from the Hellenistic tradition. Like, for example, you will find Abu Musar speaking about this and talking about this tradition again.
Yes.
And it would be interesting to see at that point in that kind of horoscopic milieu what they are calculating and how are they calculating this kind of techniques, if they're using them at all. It would be interesting, I think.
Yes. Well, Abu Mashar does talk about lots, not just in the Great Introduction to Astrology, which is the main source, I think, for the full exposition of lot technique. He talks about lots also in the Book of Religions and Dynasties, and in various other places. In his book on the revolutions of the nativities, lots play a fairly prominent role, and he actually uses chart examples, actual chart examples that contain lots that he then interprets. So we know at least that Abu Mashar is doing this kind of thing. The fact that the lot tradition basically goes right through the Arabic periods, and you see all the really well-known astrologers like Al-Qabisi and Al-Biruni and Ibn Ezra and Banati, they're all talking about this. In the Great Introduction, Abu Mashar devotes an entire book. Book 8 is entirely on lots, and it's a very well organized system. So he talks about the 7 planetary lots, and then he talks about the 97 lots of the places, and then he talks about 10 other lots that don't fit into any of those prior categories. So he's got quite a collection. However, you can actually find earlier material that discusses quite a number of these same lots that he takes up. So in the Hellenistic milieu, for instance, in Olympiodorus, and you can find this in the critical edition of Olympiodorus, and also in the translation that I did of him, of his commentary on Paulus, we see pretty much those same lots, almost 100 of them, or maybe even a little over 100 different lots. So people who think, oh, well, it was the Arabs who proliferated this huge lot thing that was going on. It's I would say that they popularized it, and Abu Mashar organized it in a certain way, and his reputation was such that it sort of became codified in the tradition at that point. But there is definitely a line of transmission. And of course you're going to get in documentary charts, not just the lots that I've been talking about, the planetary lots, or the ones that I've previously mentioned, but a lot of the father, a lot of the mother, a lot of siblings, lots of different ones. Sorry for the pun. Lots of lots.
And
Lots of lots.
Yeah, lots of lots. And commenting also on that idea of the Arabic origin of these lots, which is completely erroneous. I think that really derives from the Renaissance and early modern period, where they're doing all this revision.
They were taking them away, and therefore calling them Arabic, which
there's
was
this anti-Arabic
a good
yes.
take them away.
Yeah,
Yes.
and the Arabic parts are the so-called Arabic part. The lots are within this bundle of things which
That
are
were
discarded out of astrology because they are from traditions that they don't
They are
agree
not
with.
the pure Greek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Well, I think perhaps it to a certain point, I think nowadays that's already changed. Historiography picked up on that idea and carried on with that idea, and didn't really do a revision until a few decades ago, to really understand how this process of revision happened.
Yes, I should just point out quickly though that when you say Arabic parts is a misnomer. It is, of course, probably not the best way to characterize them, but I should point out that there are some lots that appear to have been invented by Arabic astrologers, and here I'm thinking of Al-Biruni and his
they added
myriad lots of cucumbers and grapes and olive oil and all that stuff, you know. I don't think there's anything like that in Abu Mashar.
I don't remember. Yeah. Just
and people, you know, people make fun of it, but I suppose if you're growing cucumbers, it's good to know if your crop is going to be successful.
I have the text that I studied in my PhD, and that Simon Belle, he uses the lots for revolutions of the year.
Yes, and so did Abu Mashar.
We have meat and cereal and milk and honey and all sorts of lots. So yes. And probably they were inventing the lots as they needed more lots. Actually, it's very interesting the way they address, because we have in this source we have 7 different revolutions of the year, and the way they talk about the lots, they always begin by the weather, of course, and then meat, fish, and vegetables and honey, and it comes in a certain order, and we can imagine that this is the importance that they give to this.
These products.
I suppose they were using the lots as they were needing them.
Yes, for sure.
On future projects, do you have anything? I know that you're preparing this paper and the publication of this paper that on the lots that we were mentioning.
Yes. Well, this paper, I also have another paper that I'm working on that talks about more about Abu Mashar's lot system, not so much the planetary lots, but the lots of the places, and where that's coming from. So I'm documenting that part of the tradition in an article that is going to come out of the Abu Mashar conference that Charles did. Gosh, it seems like not that long ago, but I think it was maybe a year and a half or so ago.
2018 November, if I'm not.
Yes, exactly. So from that, I also have in the pipeline an article that I wrote on divination and decumbiture. That is another one of my interests, is astrology and medicine. And I'm doing that for a book that's being edited by my friend and classicist Crystal Addy, who is an expert in divination and especially in Neoplatonic studies. So I'm hoping that's going to be out within the next year or so. And then the topic that, which is definitely not firm yet, but the topic that I would have been presenting had our little conference taken place.
But you will hear.
It will.
It will. Yeah, I became interested in looking at the dignity system, and I won't go into why I became interested in it, but what I'm interested also in is the transmission, the cultural transmission of dignities, and in particular, why they suddenly get weighted, so that each dignity has a certain amount of points.
It was not like that in the Greek tradition.
It was not. Every dignity each got a point.
One dignity, yes.
Yeah.
One point, yes.
Yeah, so I'm interested in that transition as well. And I have no idea how that's going to develop yet. So I'll just say that's one of my interests now too.
So a lot to look forward to.
Lots of lots.
This is assuming that I can actually get it all done.
In your abundant spare time.
In my abundant spare time. Yes, right, exactly.
Okay, Dorian. Thank you very much for being here with us and accepting our invitation. It was lovely to discuss this with you. And we hope
We
to
wish
see
you
you.
luck.
I wish you very luck with your projects and all the success with your projects and publications. And perhaps we can see you at in the future podcast discussing one of these topics, discussing one of these few papers that's to come, or any other topic that we find interest to
Yes.
discuss a little bit more and to deepen a little bit more in terms of the academic research that's going into it.
So
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to say thank you too for inviting me to have this little conversation. It was a pleasure. It's a delight to discuss ideas with, as my husband puts it, my fellow wizards. And so thank you very much for inviting me, and it was just really lovely to have this time to talk together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.